Thanks for coming in this morning and being part of a learning process on a topic that's become very complex and a hot button topic. When we started our journey with El Salvador about 15 years ago, one of our first sources of inspiration and information was Tim Muth. He's been an unfailing source of objective and well-researched information on many resources, both in El Salvador and in terms of El Salvador's relationship with the United States. So when we thought about approaching this topic, we didn't have to think any further than asking Tim, and he graciously said yes. So I will turn it over to him, and he can fill the hour with lots of information.
I want to thank both Gretchen and Pastor Chris for the invitation. I really love coming to St. Matthew's. It's going to be a tough act to follow the kids and the program during the service. You know, immigration is such a hot button political issue right now, but it's also an issue and a topic that's central to our faith story. I mean, if you think about the biblical stories and the biblical journey, starting with Abraham and Sarah traveling after receiving God's promise. And then you have Joseph's family facing starvation in where they were living and going to Egypt, where food had been stored up for a period of drought. And then years later, you have Moses leading the people of God, on a journey, on a migration for 40 years in the desert. But again, a story of migration to the promised land. And then another migration story as Joseph and Mary, hearing that there are death threats against the baby Jesus, flee to Egypt, seeking safety for their son from violence. So immigration is something that is wrapped up in our faith story, in our faith journey. Now, when I was coming up with the title, on the title, so there are people on what we call the left in the United States who would say that there's not a crisis happening south of the U.S. border, and I disagree. What's happening right now is a crisis, is an immigration emergency of literally tens of thousands of people seeking refuge, seeking asylum, and how are we going to respond to that? And as this slide illustrates. And that it's one of the handouts that you received today. The dark Customs and Border Patrol that as many as combined 70,000 people or more were apprehended across the U.S. border. And so one of the things I want to talk about is why people are leaving, and to help with that, a 10-minute news story on the PBS NewsHour that I'd like to play now, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it after we switch from PowerPoint to video. And I leave this to my head audio visual.
Don't blame me.
On the screen.
Immigration turmoil at the U.S.-Mexico border, where Customs and Border Control officials say they are on track to make 100,000 apprehensions this month alone. Many of those people come from Central America, and even as the president again threatened this week to withhold aid and shut the border because of the migration, his administration signed a pact with several of those same nations to bolster their internal security. With the support of the Pulitzer Center, special correspondent Marcia Biggs and videographer Julia Galeano Rios recently traveled to San Pedro Sula in Honduras to see why so many are fleeing their home.
They came from far and wide, migrants from all parts of Honduras, gathering at the bus station in San Pedro Sula and settling in for a long night of camping out before a dawn departure. It wasn't clear why or who made the decision, but 8 hours earlier than planned, this caravan of families set off on the harrowing journey to the United States. It wasn't long before the weather turned nasty, but the people pressed on. Some have suggested that the caravans were organized by political activists, but there was no organization here, only desperation.
They were supposed to leave at 5 o'clock in the morning tomorrow. They left at 9 o'clock in the pouring rain. We've got entire families with toddlers, babies. They've got nothing but the clothes on their backs. And they don't even really know where they're going. They're just following the crowd, hoping for a better life.
I know that it will be a difficult journey, says 19-year-old Alicia, as she cradles her 8-month-old baby. But I want a better life for my son. Olman Del Cid said he had no choice but to start walking with his wife and 5 children.
It is too dangerous here. We can't stay here. There is no work, and I can't afford to pay the extortion.
Their numbers were nothing like the some 7,000 that marched through Central America and into Mexico last October. Estimates put this group at around a third of that, but they are no less determined. Yolanda Gonzalez has worked as a human rights activist in Honduras for the last 17 years.
It's like one boy told us, why am I leaving? Because in my neighborhood, you're more likely to get shot than to find a job. When you ask people why they are leaving or why once deported they try to go back, the story typically starts with, well, I'm leaving for economical reasons. But when you start to inquire further, they say, I had my bodega, but I lost it because of extortion, violence, and because I don't have anyone to report to who can protect me. I can't go to the police because the police won't protect me. And what's more, I'm afraid of the police. Therefore, I have no other choice but to leave. And if I get deported, I will try again.
San Pedro Sula used to be the murder capital of the world, held hostage by gangs. The most prominent, MS-13 and the 18th Street gangs. But a crackdown led by the government of President Juan Orlando Hernandez, fueled by American dollars, has led to a much-touted decrease in homicide rates, down over 1/3 since 2011. Yet the people still live in fear.
But we keep hearing that the homicide rates are down, that crime is down, violence is down. Do you not believe that?
No. No. I think there are a lot of tricks there. Sometimes a half-truth is more harmful than a lie. Oddly enough, the homicide rate started to fall when the counting methodology changed. Now only police can get that data. Before, the data was compared with other sources. Now it's just one source.
Representatives of the government did not grant our interview requests, but everyone we spoke to talked about extortion by gangs, a concept so normalized it's referred to as war tax. As we drove around some of the poorest neighborhoods in San Pedro Sula, we saw home after home abandoned by those who couldn't afford to pay. 33-year-old Gabriela Gonzalez is one of those people, too scared of the gangs to let us show her face. She lived illegally in the United States for 8 years, finally making enough money to buy 3 cars and start a small taxi company. She returned to her country full of hope.
Y pues el primer año me fue bien.
It went well during the first year. In 2014, I started to pay the first war tax. By the middle of the following year, I got the other war tax. Then it was 2 war taxes. I endured. I thought I could. When I got the 3rd war tax, I said no more.
To pay 1 war tax is normal, but you just couldn't handle 3.
Yes. They don't care if you're sick, if you have someone in the hospital, or if your car broke down. Even if you don't want to be involved, they'll get you involved. Do you understand? When they look for you, they already know all your moves.
Do you know of other people that haven't paid the war tax?
People who are now under the ground.
She says her husband got sick last year and they got behind in their payments. One day, a truck pulled up to their home and 5 men got out, giving them 15 minutes to come up with the cash. She says they stalled them and ran.
What do you think would have happened if you hadn't run away? If you hadn't left?
I wouldn't be sitting here telling this story.
They are now living in hiding. Gabriela's changed her hair and rarely goes outside. She and her mother run a small restaurant out of the house, but today we were the only customers. They sold their nest egg of taxi cabs, keeping 1 just for emergencies. A constant reminder of the hope they once felt, which was dashed in an instant.
On one Sunday afternoon, we had to make the decision to leave, running away from our own country. I'm telling you, I wouldn't be sitting here. My whole family would be under the ground, because this has happened to other families who didn't pay the war tax. They start by taking your work, your income, then they take your life.
Like most Hondurans we met, Gabriela never filed a report and therefore has no evidence of the threats. Yolanda Gonzalez says reporting crime accomplishes nothing.
I understand that in the United States, when people are apprehended, they are told, but you didn't file a report. Of course, if you casually ask someone here why they didn't file a report, they would answer, what for, when it doesn't do anything.
We went to talk to police in Rivera Hernandez, one of the toughest areas controlled by gangs. They took us to some of the areas they say they've taken back.
We've been in this neighborhood several times and always with members of the local community, and it's been really difficult to film. It's been a struggle. I mean, highly sensitive, because they kept saying, oh, the gang is always watching. Now we're here with police, and of course the access is great, but nobody will talk to us. Everyone has retreated into their homes. There's a real culture of mistrust.
They took us to an area which they say used to be a dumping ground for bodies. They're proud of the lowered murder rates and claim to have taken back this neighborhood. But it's practically deserted. While the government statistic on violence may be down from a peak in 2011, the murder rate here remains among the highest in the world. And it's fear that drives people out. We're told that 5 families from this street alone left on the latest caravan. Gabriela's sister is an American citizen and has filed a petition to bring her to the U.S. legally. But Gabriela says that she can't wait any longer and will try to go anyway, even though it may hurt her case if she tries to cross illegally.
Have you heard what people are saying in the United States about people coming from Honduras?
That they treat us like animals, that we're going to contaminate the United States, that most of us are bad people. It's not like that. As with everything else.
are coming to the southern U.S. border and seeking to enter the United States are not the gang members, are not the people charging what's called the war tax in Honduras or the rent in El Salvador. Instead, it's their victims. It's people like the woman you saw in this video. And what we see are families with children, not, I think President Trump said that the people who are crossing are guys who could be in ultimate fighting championships, but no, it's families pushing strollers and women and children. But let me talk about some of the questions. So the numbers are coming out of the country of Guatemala. Secondly, from Honduras, and behind that, El Salvador. Actually, in these three countries of violence and of economic poverty and other reasons that push people to migrate. They're not new in 2018, 2019. These conditions have existed for a number of years. So why the big increase currently at the beginning of 2019? One impact is what I call the caravan effect. And it is not that all these people are coming in caravans. In fact, the majority of people still travel in small groups, often aided by human smugglers called coyotes. But they are traveling up through Mexico. But for those who can't afford a human smuggler, the caravans have lowered the price because the reason people join together in caravans is for safety. The travel through Mexico is incredibly dangerous because of Mexican gangs and cartels that prey on the migrants going north. And so these caravans, where there is safety in numbers, have allowed certain people to make the decision to leave. The other thing that has happened is all the publicity about the caravans has induced people to leave. Another thing that has happened has been a changing environment within Mexico. So for a period of time, starting in December and January into February, the new government in Mexico was granting humanitarian visas to people who entered seeking refuge, so that they could transit legally through Mexico. So prior to that, it wasn't just that Central Americans were crossing the border illegally from Mexico into the United States. They also needed a visa that they didn't have or documents to enter Mexico. And most deportations back to Central America were actually deportations of people picked up in Mexico and then being deported back to Central America. And it was something where there's a tremendous amount of abuse by Mexican authorities, a lot of corruption by Mexican authorities, picking up people. And now through the middle of February, for a period of about 3 months, the Mexican government was providing a humanitarian visa that meant people would not be deported out of Mexico. Mexico has terminated that program. They now say that they're going to institute a program where you apply first in your country of origin, in El Salvador and Honduras, but a better treatment of migrants in Mexico has also, I believe, led to an added flow of people out of the Northern Triangle countries. So they travel from citizen, she could apply for her parents, after the 7 years or so that it takes to become a U.S. citizen. But for other family relationships, sisters, from El Salvador, you don't even qualify for the green card lottery, so that's not a way in. Asylum exists where you can show that you have been personally persecuted and suffered damages. Travel from Central America to try to U.S. citizen, you show your passport or your migration card, and you enter if you are a Mexican. For today. And as tens of thousands, and it is tens of thousands of people are arriving at the border each month, those waiting lists, as you can imagine, are getting to be weeks and months long. the ports of entry. In other words, to find a way to cross the Rio Grande River and step onto U.S. soil where they are entitled to apply for asylum, or to go out into the desert away from a port of entry and try to cross through the desert into the United States. Under U.S. law, it does not matter if you entered, which way you entered the United States, whether you entered over the bridge or you entered what's called without inspection between the ports of entry. Once you are on United States soil, you are entitled to apply for asylum. Now, if you entered away from the port of entry, you can still be prosecuted for a crime of entering illegally. The first time it's a civil violation, and after that it is a criminal violation. But you still have that right to apply for asylum. And how does that process? Of whether you came across the bridge or you floated across the river and were picked up there, you will be detained and put into a detention center. The first stop is something that migrants often call the ice box, because it's literally holding cells where the temperatures are kept very cold. Sometimes called a dog cage because it looks like a dog kennel. And then after that, to a detention center where you'll receive something called a credible fear interview. So. The official explanation. I recently read a court monitor's report that reported that yes, they do in fact keep the temperatures in like the mid 60s in these facilities, which feels really cold. It'll feel warm today, but if you're coming in from the desert, it does feel quite cold. You might have how the process was working in 2017, 2018. So after you go from the holding facility For seeking asylum, U.S. law and authorities recognize that not everybody who crosses the border and says, I want asylum, is entitled even to try and prove a case. Instead, there is a process of what's called .95% of the women there were found by the federal government employees working for the Trump administration to be to have a credible fear. Now, that doesn't mean you are released freely into the United States or even that you're going to be granted asylum. All it means is you will not be immediately deported. If you don't have deported. You don't pass the interview, you're put on a plane, you're sent back to Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and that's been the case. are not separated from the children. Also, if the adult has a criminal history.
You make it through the credible fear interview.
Yes.
And you are given an ankle bracelet or you're detained. What's the average amount of time you have to wait to have your asylum case tried?
So that is an incredibly large part of the problem, which is the backlog in immigration courts currently run from months to years in terms of, so the number of cases in immigration court, these are deportation cases, has increased from 600,000, 700,000. It was in the 600,000s at the end of the Obama administration. It's more than 800,000 pending cases currently, and cases are taking as long as years. There has not been a significant, a large enough effort to add additional immigration judges, come up with speedier ways to process these cases. And that is one of the things that people in Central America don't understand, is they hear that their relative has crossed the border into the United States, and their relative has been released, might be with an ankle monitor, it might be with a bond, and now they are living in Houston or Los Angeles or Chicago or wherever it might be, and their asylum case is pending. But what their relatives in Central America know is they made it into the United States. 1 year, 2 years later, they haven't been deported. They don't realize that there is this pending case that may ultimately send them back to Central America. So the delays in the system create an impression that people are successfully arriving in the United States and not subject to being deported at the end of these removal cases. And that's leading to more people potentially thinking, even if it's 2 years of safety from the gangs in my home country, that's worthwhile, perhaps, in some way. Yes?
All right, so I'm picturing kind of complex situations here. So let's say a family came with a toddler. They granted asylum. It's taking years. Guess what? They've had another child. That child is a U.S. citizen.
there are a variety of different factors. For Salvadorans, which is the country I know best, 1 out of every 4 people alive who was born in El Salvador currently lives in the United States. So everybody in El Salvador has a relative or a neighbor who lives in the United States. So for Salvadorans, it's because there's a support network in the United States. For Guatemalans and Hondurans, that's less the case. There are not as large of a percentage of either of those countries living in the United States. There are, matter of fact, I tweeted about this yesterday, there are a growing number of people seeking refuge in Costa Rica. Mexico, Mexico has seen a steady increase in asylum applications in Mexico. Mexico has its challenges. There's a lot of discrimination against Central American migrants in parts of Mexico, and it has its own problems with poverty and violence. So there's a complex set of factors that people think about in seeking asylum. There's a person from my sister church community who is currently seeking asylum in England. And I know other people in Spain and Italy. So, if you could get a plane ticket there, but it can be a very lonely life if there's nobody from your own support network in a country that you might be thinking to relocate to. Yes?
I'm wondering what you think the answer is. You're into it, like.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Majority, particularly of single men, the majority of them have no legal representation, and if you don't have a lawyer, 95% of the asylum cases are lost. I mean, it's just a very difficult case. So we need to have They're crossing because they've been pushed out of their home countries by economic conditions and by violence. And so investing in those countries to help them improve their security situations, investing in programs which will cut down on governmental corruption, helping farmers with techniques of farming, dealing with problems of drought in those countries, will reduce the number of people seeking to cross the southern US border. And so that's why it's incredibly confusing to me why the United States 2 weeks ago would cut off aid to these 3 countries. That's probably the most effective way to reduce migration, is not sending, army troops to the southern U.S. border, but instead to invest in programs that will keep children safe in Honduras, that will provide for economic livelihoods there. So if nothing else, I would say, I don't want a single person to leave Central America and come to the United States who feels that they're being forced to do that. And we've got to address that basic thing. There are human rights to migrate, but more importantly, there are human rights to stay in your home. And those human rights to stay and live in safety and security in your own home are being violated day in and day out in Central America. And whatever we can do to help people yes.
Is it relatively safer for people to live in the countryside as subsistence farmers, for instance? Are they safer from the gangs?
It depends on the country. I mean, it used to be that the gangs were very much a urban phenomenon, but gangs are out as policing got tougher in cities. Gangs moved out into the countryside. So it's very country, it's very community specific. But so the answer is not always. Yes.
I read a piece, and I'm not sure the accuracy of it, but approximately 10 years ago, I believe it was Ecuador, legalized the gangs, and I don't know exactly how they made the transition out of violence, but to the point where the gangs were being channeled into social programs that would do good and actually receive grants if they met certain qualifications. Does that make any sense? It was about 10 years ago, I believe it was Ecuador.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I don't know that story.
We're talking about looking for a solution so they don't come.
Yeah, with respect to the gangs Mara Salvatrucha MS-13 and the Barrio 18 gangs, which are the 2 gangs that dominate Central America. I can't see them being converted into social service organizations. But what I can see, and what is really important, are programs of rehabilitation and reinsertion out of the prisons, and working on prevention programs, offering opportunity and offering alternatives. I mean, people join gangs for a variety of reasons, but part of it is an attraction of the gang lifestyle. I mean, these are the guys with money, they're the guys with the guns, and you have to be able to offer alternatives in these countries in order to stop the recruiting into gangs. But converting the gangs themselves, the victims of the gangs, I mean, these countries have the highest murder rates in the world because of the gangs. Their victims appropriately cry out for justice, and the victims aren't going to agree with an idea of an amnesty for the gangs and converting them into civic organizations. But we can dry up their source of new recruits. We can try and pry people out of the gangs through rehabilitation and reinsertion through the criminal justice process. Well, I'll probably take one more question and then we probably have to wrap up. Yes?
How much of an increase has there been in deportation judges? Is there an increase in the number?
I believe there has been an increase, but not certainly not a sufficient increase. And the other thing that's happening is the caseload increases as the enforcement, picking more people up in the interior of the country in workplace raids or else, that adds to the caseload as well. So it's so that has offset some of the benefit of adding judges. In the handout from Migration Policy Institute, one of the things they recommend is to have asylum officers who are not immigration judges, but to develop a separate process that would be fair to the United States and fair to the asylum seeker to resolve asylum cases on a separate track from just doing it in immigration court where you have all sorts of other proceedings going on as well. And I think looking for some kind of streamlined other basis makes a lot of sense, because it's not fair either to the asylum seeker or to the United States and its people that this process drag out for years. And I think that's something that ought to be supported on a bipartisan basis. We all ought to want swift justice, but fair and impartial justice. And unfortunately, right now, we don't have that kind of a system. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. I'll stay around for people who want to talk more individually. But I always am really impressed with St. Matthew's and your willingness to address and hear about what are tough issues and to think about them in a faithful way. Thanks.